You're not recording right now?
Yep, because I record everything.
All right.
My name is Andres Reyes. I'm 36 years of age, and I'm serving a 75-year sentence, which means that if I am to complete it, I first have to outlive it. My biggest fear is dying in prison. My second biggest fear is that no one would claim my body, and I would have to do life after death. So my sister has bought a funeral plan for me, so that if I do die in prison, my body will be buried in the free world. I'll be 96 when I'm free, but I don't think I'll make it.
My mother is my rock and the strongest support that I have. We maintain a strong relationship through weekly phone calls and monthly visits. She keeps me informed on current issues and family matters. My bond with her also allows me to have a relationship with other family members. For example, if I call her and she's around family, I can speak with others that are there. These few minutes allow them to know I still exist, and they remind me that though I'm gone, I'm not forgotten.
My name is Elton Williams. My eldest son, Antonio, was 3 years old when I left home. He is now 26. He has experienced myriad joys and pains, highs and lows, and he's lived his life almost entirely without me. I have missed every important moment, every graduation and sports event, every academic achievement, and every parent-teacher conference. I've never known any of his friends, and I've never met any of his girlfriends. His mom sent copies of his report cards, and she sent pictures. She also brought him to visit and made our telephone calls possible. But it's difficult to really know your child over 30-minute telephone calls or short visits in the prison visiting room. I love him beyond what words can express, and I know that he loves me. Despite my absence, my son has grown to be the man I always hoped he'd be. His mother deserves all the credit for that.
In the United States, incarceration is distributed unevenly across neighborhoods. Poor, black, and brown neighborhoods are policed and surveilled far more than white neighborhoods. This has led scholars to use the term concentrated punishment to describe communities where so many people are locked up that the prison sentence is not just felt by the person locked up or that person's loved ones, but also by neighbors and the community at large. The effects take many forms. For instance, while black men are more likely to be locked up and sent to prison for longer and longer terms, black women are more likely to be locked out and evicted from their homes as they bear the brunt of added responsibilities and vulnerabilities. Concentrated incarceration keeps poor black and brown neighborhoods segregated, disadvantaged, and blighted, creating an effect that extends well beyond the prison system.
Truth in sentencing and mandatory minimums are just some laws that came into effect in the 1980s and 90s. Before the Truth in Sentencing Act, a person might get 20 years but do 10 of them. After the law passed, everything changed. I was charged exactly 1 month and 5 days after the new law passed, which required me to complete all 50 years of my sentence. Before Truth in Sentencing, I would have served half that time. Under the current law, my out date is 2048. I'll be 81 years of age upon release.
My name is Devon Daniels. I've been incarcerated for 22 years, 3 months, and 2 hours. Because of our long sentences, we form a family in prison. This brotherhood is built through sharing pictures, meeting guys' families on visits, playing sports and other games. I've been incarcerated with these guys for 20 plus years. I've watched their kids grow up to have kids, and I have comforted brothers in their losses. One of the main games that form these bonds and these brotherhoods is chess. It's a game that can be played without being in the same cell. You can actually play someone upstairs or downstairs. Many of us are blessed to still have our family support, but some guys don't have anyone, so we are all we have for the long term.
Incarceration separates us from family and society, physically and even in terms of regular communication. We often receive family news after the fact, by phone or mail. On occasion, we receive family news in real time, on screen. When breaking news flashes across the screen, it's rarely good.
The reality of shackles, locks, and walls are common in here. And when you're locked up for so long, it's hard to remember the world outside is different. Twice a year, I leave the prison to go to an outside hospital for a procedure. I'm always escorted by 2 officers, locked in shackles and cuffs and my blues. Every time we approach the hospital lobby, I see people looking at me, and I feel a certain kind of way, like a wild animal. It's as if I'm not a part of them, but instead something ate me. I hate that feeling. None of these people know me or what I'm locked up for. I feel like it's just the cost of being in prison.
My name is Raul Fernandez. In prison, we are told what to do and when to do it. Isolated from the real world, we forget what it's like to be around people with free agency. I fear that being in prison for so long will program me. In the last few years, a lot of innocent people being free. I know that one day I'll prove my innocence too, and I always wonder what it'll be like to walk out of the cell like plates. I think at that moment I'm already panicked by the reporters asking questions. The noise of moving cars and moving people. The reality is that long-term incarceration can affect most inmates psychologically.
Society wants to believe that people can change and become productive community members. Even those convicted of murder got the chance to prove so after 11 years in prison when considered for parole. We thought 11 years an excruciatingly long time to be in prison. Then we abandoned parole and rehabilitation, went on a 4-decade-long bender of dehumanizing tough-on-crime rhetoric, labeled children permanently incorrigible, and enacted one ill-conceived sentencing law atop another. Now the average murder sentence is 50 years, a de facto life sentence, and it isn't just people convicted of murder receiving them. Already over 5,000 Illinoisans have sentences that require them to die in prison after decades there, and hundreds more receive them annually. This costs billions of dollars with no benefit to society.
prison, there are a few precious things that lift our hopes for freedom or life outside of prison. My hopes were first lifted when I heard about the prosecution of Police Commander John Burge, who tortured people into confessions in Chicago. When my case was first investigated, it seemed as though my prayers were answered. The release of Sean Worrell, the Dixmoor 5, the Marquette 4, just to name a few, gave me faith that one day I too would walk out of the front door of this place. When a person is exonerated, a brick is removed from the wall of systemic racism and classism. A fragmented family is made whole, the village and the community is strengthened and repaired.
The amount of time that some of us have could break us and cause us to just give up. Even when the weight of time feels like it's closing in on me, I continue to fight for freedom, even when it seems that no one cares and no one is listening. All you need is a crack to shatter the system to regain your freedom.
My name is Daryl Fair.
My name is Andres Reyes.
Sorry, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Nah, we got to redo this for real. I'm gonna nail it next time.
Hello, my name is Elton Williams, and I've been incarcerated for the past 23 years and I'm sorry, I gotta start it, bro.
Hello, my name is Sonard Miller, aka Fly One, and
I'm reading this on behalf of Francisco.
Should I say my name beforehand? Sure. Joseph Dole.
the words of Johnny Taylor. As a shorty, I was in and out of the system, and I was only ever taught
keeping elderly people locked up is one clear sign of policies focused more on punishment than on public safety.
I know that one day I proved my innocence too, and I always wondered what it'd be like to walk out of this hell-like place.
My name is Brandon Shaw. Not good, huh? Not good.
Do another one?
Okay, let me do this again.
There's so many weird things that you change, when you become a solitary person, and I don't know if that's gonna, just like when we eat super fast. Am I gonna go out and everybody's gonna be like, what the are you doing?
Hello, everyone. We just finished watching The Long Term, made by men who are serving long-term or life sentences at Stateville Prison, along with Sarah Ross and Damon Locks of the Prison and Neighborhood Arts Project, also known as PNAP. PNAP is a visual arts and humanities project that connects teaching artists and scholars to men at Stateville Maximum Security Prison in Crest Hill, Illinois, through classes, workshops, and guest lectures. And we're so honored to have Sarah Ross and Damon Locks with us here today. If you want to wave, Sarah and Damon. In addition to Sarah Ross's fabulous work with PNAP, she's also an instructor at the school at the Art Institute of Chicago and a member of Chicago Torture Justice Memorials. And in addition to his fantastic work with PNAP, Damon Locks also helms the incredible performance group and band Black Monument Ensemble, and he is an artist in residence at the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago's Space Program at the Sarah E. Good STEM Academy. And as you can see, we also have two other fabulous guests with us here today. So Eric Blackmon, you want to wave, Eric? Wonderful. Eric is a paralegal at the MacArthur Justice Center, and he is also a former PNAP student from his time at Stateville, where he spent 16 years wrongfully incarcerated. Eric became a paralegal during that time, and through his efforts was able to become exonerated, and he's been out now for almost exactly 2 years. And Sarah Grady, want to wave for us as well? Sarah is an attorney at civil rights law firm Lovey and Lovey, where she leads the Prisoners' Rights Project, which advocates for people who are locked up in jails, prisons, and detention centers all over the country. And I'm Jane Beachy. I'm the artistic director at Illinois Humanities, where I lead the Envisioning Justice Project. Today's conversation is a part of the Pivot Arts Festival. If you happened here by another channel, please go check out all of the wonderful offerings from this festival at pivotarts.org. www.ccc.org/festival. So before we launch into this conversation, one more thing. If you are watching this conversation with us live and you have questions, thoughts, or comments, please drop them into the chat and we'll do our best to be in conversation with you. We're also going to be sharing some fantastic resources throughout the course of the live stream. So be sure to take some time with those. It takes a while to let the magnitude of everything settle in, but it's really well worth it. And if you're not watching live, don't worry, just go to the event page on Pivot Art's website, and those resources will be there as well. Okay, how's everybody doing? Should we do this? Good, okay. So before we get into just the magnificence, the artistic magnificence that is this film, I do want to place it a little bit in a broader context. So obviously we know this film is called The Long Term, and it was made by Damon and Sarah, along with men serving very long-term and even life sentences. But terms like theirs, long sentences like these, were not always common. And we've seen an explosion in rates of extreme long-term sentences in the United States since the 70s and 80s. Actually, one of the narrators in the film says, "Society once believed that people could change and become productive members of society. Even those convicted of murder got a chance to prove so after 11 years in prison." But as we know, that's not remotely the case today. So Eric Blackmon and Sarah Grady, can you kind of help us understand the phenomenon of long-term sentencing in Illinois and in the United States, and sort of how did we get here?
Well, I guess I'll start. I guess the answer is simply, it really began, the prison boom began with the war on drugs in the 80s. And then we really seen the change in sentencing start in the 90s, first federally with the Violent Offenders and Truth in Sentencing Act that was passed by the federal government that ultimately provided funds to states to ultimately get tougher on crime. And here in Illinois, it was initially passed in '94, it was repealed, and then in 1998, where it became law. And that law ultimately changed the sentences from like 50% in small time sentences for most people to violent offenders and people who they deem to be violent offenders to have to serve 85 to 100% of their times. That, along with other enhancements that ultimately followed, meant that sentences that were once moderate ended up to balloon to be quadruple their numbers that they were in years past.
And to build a little bit off of what Eric talked about, before the war on drugs began, there was actually a push by both sides of the aisle to move from indeterminate sentences where people who are convicted of any crime were given a range of time, a minimum time and a maximum time. And then largely parole boards made decisions about when those individuals would be able to be released. And, you know, during that time, you could still earn good time for, you know, days that you were in custody and were doing what you needed to do or taking educational classes or things like that. But at the end of the day, it was still typically up to a parole board to make decisions. And there was a move to determinative sentencing where there was just a set period of imprisonment at the time of sentencing because there was a fear by tough on crime groups that people were actually serving far less than what the sentence appeared to be, and a concern by the other side that this was resulting in people of color serving far greater sentences for basically the same crimes, which, you know, was borne out by the data. And so unfortunately what happened was what was intended to be a move toward a fairer system that was transparent ended up resulting in outrageously long sentences because, as Eric talked about, the Truth in Sentencing Act and the war on drugs ended up ratcheting these sentences up to a very high number. And we know that a lot of people who are in custody in the state of Illinois are subject to these laws. There are approximately 40% of the people in custody are subject to some form of truth in sentencing. What we know from that is many of those people are serving sentences that mean that they will be significantly older when they are released from custody, or won't be released from custody at all, which is both inhumane and extremely expensive.
And I mentioned at the top of the conversation some of the resources that are have been made available to us by this wonderful group. So Sarah Ross and Eric Blackmon, I know you put together a really amazing guide that sort of illustrates some of what Eric and Sarah Grady just talked about, and really highlights a lot of these statistics and numbers that, as I say, just take a while to digest because they are overwhelming. And speaking of overwhelming, the film itself is really an overwhelming thing of beauty. And I have had the great fortune to watch it many times, as it was part of Illinois Humanities Envisioning Justice exhibition this past fall. And I noticed that, much like the resource guide, every time I go back to the film and watch it again, kind of new layers are surfaced for me, whether it's, you know, a particular moment in the animation of someone's face flickering in and out with something else, or whether it's just recognizing the way the score is playing with what the narrators are saying and kind of moving us through people's thoughts. So Sarah and Damon, Sarah Ross and Damon, can you talk to us a little bit more about, we know that you made this film with currently incarcerated men at Stateville. What was that collaboration like? How did it work? And what sort of inspired the making of this film in this way in the first place?
I'll start. The film really got started, or the project really got started, because when we first started teaching at Stateville, we definitely noticed that people had really long sentences. And I remember early on talking to a lawyer and asking, why do people have these really long sentences, like indeterminate sentences or 80, 90-year sentences, when ostensibly their record might look like a record of somebody else who had taught at a different prison at a different time? And so it was pretty shocking just to learn how many students that we worked with would not probably see the free world unless we mobilize and do something, unless we continue to educate people and really sort of push to make changes. So years ago, Damon, myself, and Fareshta Tusi did a project around time, and we got other PNAP collaborators involved. And we thought sort of critically about the role of time inside, time being really slow in prison, and time outside being really fast. And through that, just learning these really, really lengthy sentences. And so maybe Damon, you can pick it up from there just to talk about how we got to the project.
Yeah, well, my first teaching semester at Stateville through PNAP, I introduced an idea for doing a project called Freedom Time, which was part of the thing that Sarah was just referencing. And I thought it would be interesting to do an animation project to explore the subject of time through this hand-drawn, you know, for that piece, it was like 100 frames of animation per student, hand-drawn on tracing paper over and over and over again. And I thought, oh, this is an interesting way of kind of like exploring this idea and talking about time through this project. And it became a very moving piece. I think Freedom Time was something that, for me as a teaching artist, was one of the most impactful things that I've done. And it was a way that we could actually also share people's thoughts. I was able to take it to schools and show it different places and exhibit it and stuff. And so a couple of years later, Sarah introduced me to the idea of, let's bring back the animation and let's look at the long term. Let's filter the long term through this animation project. And so whereas the Freedom Time had these chapter-esque parameters. The long term is a weighty, so many, tentacles of issues that are involved in it. And how do we open that? How do we open that up, and how do we explore it? And luckily, I would say that PNAP classes we've been teaching so long that the guys at Stateville are ready and willing to dig into the difficult subjects. So thankfully, when asked, they were able to pull out information from their lives and from their studies and from their personal knowledge from their cases and help create these things. So Sarah, why don't you talk about how we dug into that?
Yeah, so there was a real question of like, why are people serving such really long terms, talking to folks inside, and really, wanting to unpack what things like truth in sentencing means. Like, it just felt like a big conundrum. Like, what is that thing? And yet it's something that sweeps up so many people for so long. And so we started the year by just printing out every news study we could find about long-term sentencing. And it turns out some of the bigger think tanks like the Urban Institute and the Sentencing Project had just put out all this brand new information about the real rise of long-term sentences and life and what they call virtual life sentences, people serving 50 years or more. And that number has changed, but it sweeps in a lot of people. And it really is a kind of other kind of death penalty. Illinois got rid of the death penalty in 2011 officially, but we have all these people inside who will die unless laws change. And so we studied the most recent studies. People looked at law. We looked at the history of how we got here, and we tried to really map it out of like Damon said, like, what are all the tentacles of something like truth in sentencing? What does that mean for the community where we live, where we all live? What does this mean for the families that are waiting in the visiting room? So we tried to like map that out. We literally made this huge mind map on a huge roll of paper and just kept adding to it. And that gave us the basis to start to develop a narrative. And we sort of delivered the narrative, if you will, through a model that had been used in other projects, which is kind of like a kind of collaborative story, where you kind of weave narratives together to make one larger story. And so that's the way that we got the script. And then, as Damon said, the artists that we've been working with for years at Stateville are really amazing. They taught us a lot about how to make work and make it, with sometimes bare conditions of materials. And so we're really able to over a long period of time, develop relationships so that the work was sort of quote unquote easy to make. It felt like there was a good working relationship, and also develop the year to do the research needed to make a story like the long term makes.
And there was I think that project was a really wonderful artistic collaboration, because Sarah and I didn't really know what we were going to make, or how it would come out, or what it would look like at the end. We enlisted Rob Shaw, a professional animator from the West Coast. I collaborated with him for the first piece, Freedom Time. And so he was in on this, and he came in and did a lot of technical work and kind of opened the door and kind of showed how to make animations and what the options were. So we worked really hand in hand with Rob on building this. And we learned new skills. The guys in class learned new skills. And if you look at it, there, so many of the guys really like took to this animation project and created something that, is really, really wonderful. One of the things that I feel that this piece does is that it weaves information, like solid factual information, with the emotional impact. So you are allowed to feel and hear and kind of gain knowledge about the impact of this system on people's lives. And I think that that is the strength of the piece. And I think that for me, doing the art classes at Stateville, there are words, there's the written word, there are the facts, but then there's the place that art goes. And the art goes somewhere in here and here and here. And I think that, yeah, the guys really nailed it on that one.
Definitely agreed. And I love that you both brought up the strength of the relationships that you've built over time with the PNAP students and artists who contributed to this piece. And then it's something that we hear from several of the contributors throughout the piece as well, that sense of community that, that they've built among themselves. And so I can't help but think about community in this present moment where the elephant in the virtual room is our present public health crisis, which, as we know, is happening all over the world and also very, very much so inside of Stateville. So I want to kind of open this back up to all four of you to sort of ask, and Eric Blackmon, I know you laughed at me the last time I asked it, and I look forward to getting behind that laughter and hearing everyone's reflections, but is the present public health situation in any way providing an opportunity to make change as it relates to mass incarceration or long-term sentencing? Or do you feel like it's kind of only serving to like exacerbate and exponentially sort of highlight all the conditions that brought the project and the film into being in the first place? Eric, you start. You laughed last time.
Well, I really think Miss Grady should start because she's at the forefront of this whole argument, being that she's done so much great work towards fighting for a lot of those guys there now, and just the capacity that she does. But I'll try to give it what we see now is that a few people are being granted clemency. I think that's one of the best parts that comes of it all. But we are ultimately seeing a lot of people there aren't guaranteed the basic needs that they need for this crisis that's going on. This pandemic has swept through these prisons, and we see people who should not be incarcerated dying at rates that are unthinkable for the most part, and people are being sick and infected and not just getting the basic human rights or human needs that they need. And it's just truly sad, to say the least. I know that these people are, or we, because I consider myself to be one of those people, are considered people who've done something wrong at one point in time, but we were not sentenced to death. We were not given death sentences, and the way that they're being treated and not given the basic care and things that they need, I think is really, really troubling. And for every clemency, we're seeing more people die. I mean, I don't think the numbers are really adding up.
Sarah Grady?
Yeah, I think, you know, one thing I think that is positive that has come out of this is that we see that arrest rates are significantly lower than they've been really at any recent point in history. And what we see as a result of that is that there is no meaningful increase in crime. In fact, crime rates are actually lower than they've been in recent history as well. So I think that that can help to change this you know, broken stereotype that the reason we have so many people in prison is because there are dangerous people doing dangerous things, and the only way to keep people safe is to lock them up. I do think, though, that, you know, by the governor's own admission, prisons and jails are places where there can be no adequate protection from this virus. And so I think it's really putting truth to the lie that we can take someone into custody and do something that is anything more than, you know, barbaric warehousing. And I think that people are being forced to confront that, including policymakers and decision makers at all levels of government. as we see the coronavirus taking its toll at Stateville, taking its toll at Cook County Jail, and forcing people who are there serving sentences, but as Eric said, were not sentenced to death, but they are losing their lives as a result. I know it can feel for all of us sometimes like we're all penned in, when it's a nice day and you want to get out. But I would just encourage anyone who has those thoughts to go sit in your bathroom and then have, imagine what it would be like to have someone you've never met before, then come and share that bathroom with you. Because that's, in some senses, roughly what it's like to be in prison. And then imagine that that's where you will spend the next 3 months while the pandemic rages on. And obviously we know it's many years. And that's where you'll eat your food that's been handled by people you don't know, and you don't know whether those people have had the virus or have the virus. So I think the good is that it's exposing a lot of what is wrong with the system. I think, unfortunately, what I've personally seen in being involved in lawsuits over the coronavirus is that the system is so dominant and so permeated throughout so many aspects of our public life that it is all but impossible to dismantle. And so, I really thank the work of Damon and Sarah to bring the voices of the people who are in custody to the fore, because that is the only way that I think we're going to be able to take any meaningful action to dismantle this barbaric, imprisonment policy in this country and in this state.
Yeah, Sarah Ross.
Yeah, I would just add that that I think that in addition to any silver lining might be that I think that conversations about incarceration are much more in the news, and conversations about the ability for any kind of healthcare in prison has been much more in the news. So that's a small silver lining, but I don't think it all outweighs the real risk to people's lives inside. But also too, as it relates to the long term, one of the things that has been a determinant among public officials of who could be let out of prison are people who have nonviolent offenses on their records, and that doesn't at all deal with actually the health risk. So that is a problem. Moreover, there's a whole subset of people in prison who are there on certain kinds of laws, like accountability laws or felony murder laws, which means that they didn't actually pull the trigger or they didn't commit the sort of violent act themselves. They were in the proximity of someone who did it. And Sarah and Eric could correct me on the law there. But that is just to say that there's people who are labeled, or there's people who defended themselves in a domestic violence situation, for instance, who are in prison based on and labeled as quote unquote violent offenders, and so that doesn't at all actually look at some real issues of how people get labeled, and then that means that their life now is at risk. But in general, I don't think it's even useful to be parsing out this idea of violent versus nonviolent crime, because in fact, most of the people that Damon and I worked with, most of the people in the film committed a crime when they were young people. And now they have, it's 20 years later and they'll spend the rest of their life in prison for something terrible that might have happened on one day. And that is to say that they are not their crime. They might have committed a crime, or they might have harmed something or somebody, but they themselves are not walking acts of violence, right? And so, so the fact that there's a sort of conversation about who deserves to live, who deserves to be let out early based on someone's record seems highly problematic. And so I think it's another chance in history that we really have to work hard to have these conversations, to educate people and let people know about what the system is and how it works, and how it, again, it's failing people.
And Sarah, to jump off of that, when you talk about harm, we have to think about as a society how we want to deal with harm. So if in the case that 20 years ago someone did something to harm someone, how are we going to deal with that? Because the system that we have isn't really doing the job. So that's also something that's one of the tentacles as well.
Well, and just to build off of what Damon said, you know, I mean, we also have to take into account the community harm, because when a person is taken and put into custody for an extremely long period of time, that person often leaves behind many loved ones, maybe children, maybe, you know, a spouse, maybe parents who would have relied on them to be caregivers as those parents aged. And so we have a very do the crime, do the time, eye for an eye view of punishment that came from the tough on crime punitive turn in the 90s. But what we see now is, you know, the devastation that policy has wrought, and it's time for a reckoning and a larger recognition of all the important issues, including the harm on victims, which is worth important consideration, but it must be taken into account as part of a larger approach, and, you know, must also actually take into account the voices of the victims rather than just a group of people who want to win elections by proving they're tough on crime.
I appreciate all the references to the tentacles within this piece as well. I think I see it in the animation in a couple of places, some of the patterns that like spread apart and come back together. And one of the most images that was the most striking to me the first time I watched it is the arm that sort of snakes out of the prison wall and then grabs something from the community, pulls it back in, you know, just sort of depleting the community as we go. So there's a lot to digest in that, and a lot more tentacles yet that we can explore, which I want to leave space for if people want to talk about those things. But I also do want to spend a little bit of time talking about hope and kind of the role of hope in this particular moment in time, and also in this movement to end mass incarceration and to end long-term sentencing. And I pulled a quote again from the film from one of the narrators who says, "Even when the weight of time feels like it's closing in on me, I continue to fight for freedom. Even when it seems like no one cares and no one is listening. All you need is a crack to shatter the system to regain your freedom." So I'll start with you, Eric Blackmon, again. But I'd love to hear from each of you, your vantage points, kind of where are those cracks, and how can people who are watching and listening today do their part to help shatter the system?
Wow. I don't think we have enough time to talk about all of them, but I just think that people in society in general controls just the way we think, or just the way that politicians and legislators ultimately will vote, because they are, you know, seeking their vote and seeking their approval and those type of things. So I think that the way to shatter it is to basically start there, speaking out against this injustice that we see happening. I think that that's the first and best way we can do it, and that's the only way to ultimately change it. We can go to courts, we can do the arts and everything, and I believe that those ultimately shape the way that society will view these things and will view it all. But we just have to fix these draconian laws that, I mean, to me, I think that's the simplest answer there is. And it starts at home with every person watching this. So please pick up your phone, call a friend, call your senator, call your congressman, call your legislator. Let them know that you don't want all of your tax dollars going towards paying for prison for people that, even by the Department of Justice, like numbers, who sitting in prison when they are no longer a threat to your communities or any community. So really, it's really in your hands.
And thank you for bringing up those numbers and of tax dollars, Eric, because Sarah Grady, I don't know if did you already mention, but I know you have some statistics on hand for what the actual cost of all of this is.
Yeah, we know that many of the people who are serving these sentences that are inordinately long as a result of truth in sentencing laws, they are older prisoners now. Older prisoners because of a variety of factors, but predominantly the medical care that everyone who gets older requires. They cost the state 4 times as much as a prisoner who is younger. That's an annual cost of $428 million, which breaks down to about $68,000 per person in custody. So even by leaving to the side all the reasons, the reasons that we owe it to the people in the communities to change these laws, if your only concern is the public fisc, like that's a real important reason too. I think the 2 things that I would advocate for people to do after watching this video is, number 1, to get proximate. It's one thing I think what's so moving about this video is that it features the voices of the people who are the victims of these laws. And I think the way to ensure that this remains present in everyone's mind is to actually get proximate to someone who's in custody. I think that that's just critically important to actually being motivated to make change, because I have the privilege of knowing many people in custody, and they are really wonderful human beings who have so much love for people who take the time to reach out to them. And the second one I would say is vote. We've put power now in the hands of prosecutors and legislators. And we are finally, the other, I guess, ray of hope is we're finally seeing across the country some prosecutors running on a platform of actually decarceration. But so it's critically important that everybody who cares about social justice, who cares about who cares about reforming the criminal legal system, that you vote, and you vote, in every election. Look up the judges, find out who cares about the rights of the people who are before them in criminal court. Look up the prosecutor, see who cares about, reducing sentencing and reducing the time in prison for people convicted or charged with crimes. Vote, vote, vote. That's my message.
Thank you, Sarah. Grady. We'll drop some resources for places to go to research those things, and ways to get proximate in the comments during the live chat. Sarah Ross, where are the cracks, and how do people help shatter the system if they're so moved?
The cracks, I think, are in some of what Eric and Sarah also said, but I think that the way that I come to this is being an artist, and I think that the role of cultural work is really important. I feel like that the tool of cultural work is to both share what's happening, but also envision something different. Like, we right now have a system that we know does not work. We know it does not reduce crime. It does not reduce harm. We know that that so many lives are affected by violence, and that this system doesn't actually perpetuates that kind of violence, right? And so I hope that one thing that comes out of this project and other projects that people around the country are doing is to really imagine a different system. We were able to put people on the moon. Surely we can figure out ways that people, that we can change a system so that we're not locking up thousands and thousands of our neighbors and friends. So I think that that's the biggest sort of crack for me, is that we don't yet have a wide enough crack in our imagination of what happens when someone's hurt, or what happens when somebody does something that's a violation. The only imagination we have right now is one of punishment. And it's just such a limited, narrow view. And it's not the view that we would want for any of our children or our cousins or, et cetera. So, brothers and sisters, so we shouldn't want it for other people.
That's a great call to the Pivot Arts audience, as I imagine there are a lot of artists out there. envision something different. Yeah, Damon.
Yeah, I think these are all great answers. And when I think about hope, I mean, you know, the world looks different right now than it ever has in my lifetime. There's a spotlight that shifts around on injustice, you know. We're seeing it in all different places. The hope is that we don't look away, you know, you acknowledge it and you do something about it. I think that as an artist myself, you know, I think it's important to try to make connections with people and try to build an artistic throughway so that people can connect to the issues. And a friend of mine, Danton Floyd, who works in incarceration with youth, he said if this is going to be our justice system, then people should see it, you know? And I agree with that completely. And one way of being able to see it is to have access to it or proximity, you know? So what art can do is art can help you see it. Art can help you feel it, you know? Yeah, the hope for me is that, you know, we keep the light shining.
And thank you so much, all four of you, especially today. Thanks to Damon, Sarah, and your collaborators, both inside and outside of Stateville, for helping us to see it a little more, for showing us the cracks in the system. Thank you, Sarah Grady and Eric Blackmon, for sharing your immense expertise and knowledge. And so I think we all heard, call your legislators, get in proximity, vote. Do not let your mind be narrow and limited. Imagine something better, and find ways to keep this issue visible. So thank you so much for doing that for us, Sarah and Damon. Thanks, Eric and Sarah Grady, for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank Pivot Arts.
Yeah, thank you.
And thanks, Pivot Arts.
Thank you all.
Yes, thank you all. Thank you, Pivot Arts.
Thanks.